The February sun flooded the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church, coloring the ancient biblical scenes with all the shades of the rainbow. Mercer Holliday sat in the third row, absent-mindedly adjusting her pearl necklace. Her gaze slid over the preacher's empty pulpit as the congregation waited for the new pastor, who was due to arrive from Boston. Their old priest, Father James, had passed away 2 months ago, and the church council had been taking a long time to choose his replacement. Mercer knew all the details. She chaired the parish's women's committee and had been involved in the discussions. Randall, her husband, sat next to her, glancing at his watch. He had agreed to go to the service only because it was important to their social status in Palo Alto. "Honey, I have an investor meeting at 2, he whispered, leaning over to his wife. Mercer only nodded, used to the fact that even Sunday was a workday for him. 20 years ago, when they'd met at Stanford, Randall had been very different, a young man with a passion for physics and burning eyes. Now those eyes burned only at the sight of his technology company's profit charts. The whispers in the church died down as a tall man in a black soutane entered the side door. The Reverend Ezra Kingsley moved unhurriedly, with the dignity of a man confident in his calling. His dark hair was touched with a slight gray at the temples, and his correct facial features looked like those of a Renaissance painting. Following him, almost imperceptibly, slipped a thin woman in a modest gray dress, his wife, Agnes. She took a seat in the front row, eyes downcast, and hands folded in her lap. When Ezra began his sermon, his deep voice filled the entire space of the church. He spoke of mercy and redemption, and every word seemed to resonate in the hearts of the congregation. Mercer caught herself unable to take her eyes off his expressive face. "God gives us trials not to break us, but to make us stronger," Ezra said, and his gaze met Mercer's for a moment. She felt the color rush to her cheeks and hastily lowered her eyes. After the service, Randall, as usual, was the first to leave, pulling out his cell phone as he went. Mercer lingered. She needed to discuss the upcoming charity event with the new pastor. "Mrs. Holliday?" Ezra held out his hand to her. "Heard about your work in the parish. I look forward to a fruitful partnership." His handshake was warm and confident. Agnes stood a little farther away, thumbing her rosary beads and watching their conversation with a sidelong glance. "Welcome to Palo Alto, Reverend," Mercer smiled. "We're all very happy to have you here." As she left the church, she couldn't escape the strange feeling, as if some new door had begun to open in her measured life. Randall was waiting in the car, tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. "Darling, you know how important this meeting is," he began. Barely had she gotten into the cabin. Mercer nodded silently, looking into the side mirror, which reflected the silhouette of Reverend Kingsley blessing the last parishioners on the church steps. March had been unusually warm in Palo Alto. The almond trees around St. Michael's had turned pinkish white, and petals swirled in the air as they fell on the ancient gravestones of the church cemetery. Mercer spent more and more time at the church. Preparations for the Easter festival required daily meetings with Reverend Kingsley. They discussed the program while sitting in his office, which smelled of old books and freshly ground coffee that Ezra brewed in an old-fashioned copper turbo. "You have an amazing sense of beauty, Mercer," he'd say, as he looked over her sketches of holiday decorations. She noticed his fingers lingering on the pages her hand touched. Once, as they leaned over the seating plan, their faces were so close that Mercer could smell his cologne, something woody with a hint of incense. Ezra pulled away first, but his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. Agnes began to appear in her husband's study more often during these meetings. She brought tea and cookies, moving silently between the desk and the door like a shadow. Her presence made Mercer feel uncomfortable, even though technically everything looked flawless. The chairwoman of the women's committee discussing parish business with the pastor. "Ezra's different now." Mercer overheard 2 elderly parishioners talking after Sunday service. "It's like he's younger. Agnes says he spends hours in the garden, updating the rose garden." Roses were Ezra's passion. He pruned the bushes himself, preparing them for spring blooms. Mercer often caught him doing this when she came to church. His robe hung on the fence, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up, exposing his strong arms. At home, Mercer found her husband's office increasingly empty. Randall was working late into the night as his company prepared to go public. "Honey, this is our chance to make the big leagues," he'd say, absent-mindedly kissing her cheek as she brought dinner to his office. One evening, as they wrapped up their discussion of the charity auction, Ezra showed Mercer the church library. Among the ancient folios, he pulled out a rare edition of the Song of Songs with engravings. "Listen," his voice deepened as he began to read. "As the lily among thorns, so my beloved among maidens." Mercer felt her heart begin to beat more frequently. Their fingers made contact on the page, and neither was in a hurry to pull away. "Reverend," came Agnes's quiet voice from the doorway. "It's getting late. Mrs. Holliday must want to get back to her husband." There was a faint bitterness in her voice. Mercer said a hasty goodbye and stepped out into the cool spring evening. A note from Randall was waiting for her at home. "Important negotiations with the Japanese. I'll be back late. Don't wait up." She stood at the window, looking out at the blooming garden that no longer brought her joy. In the reflection of the glass, she saw a woman she no longer recognized, with a blush on her cheeks and a sparkle in her eyes that she hadn't seen in years. The next morning, Mercer found a withered rose flower in her Bible. She didn't remember how it had gotten there, but for some reason she didn't dare throw it away. April brought the first real heat wave to Palo Alto. Mercer began coming to the church garden in the early morning, when the dew still covered the rosebuds. She told herself it was just to take care of the parish, but each time she winced when she heard Ezra's footsteps on the gravel path. Their first kiss happened behind the old bell tower, hidden from view by overgrown ivy. Ezra touched her face, wiping away a tear. They talked about her loneliness in her marriage, the emptiness of the luxurious house on Linden Avenue. "It's a sin," Mercer whispered, but didn't pull away. "God is love," he replied, pulling her to him. Randall started coming home earlier than usual for the first time in a long time. He would stare at his wife over dinner, as if trying to read something in her face. One day he asked, "Why do you smell like incense?" "I spend a lot of time in church, you know," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yeah, too much," he remarked, and delved deeper into studying the stock market reports. Mercer's phone vibrated more and more frequently with messages that she hastily erased. She and Ezra were meeting at a bookstore in a neighboring town where no one knew them. They talked about poetry, about music, about things that had long gone from her life with Randall. Agnes had lost weight and turned pale. She tried to talk to her husband several times, but Ezra always found a reason to cut the conversation short. One morning she intercepted Mercer at the church entrance. "You do realize you're not just destroying your family, don't you?" Mercer walked past in silence, but Agnes's words haunted her all day. In early May, the first letter arrived at Kingsley's house, an envelope without a stamp or return address. Agnes had found it on the doorstep early that morning. Inside was a piece of paper with the text printed on an old typewriter, "Beware of the serpent in the Garden of Eden." Ezra tore the letter up before he finished, but a week later, a second letter arrived. "Adultery is punishable by hellfire." Attached to the letter was a picture of Ezra and Mercer in a bookstore, sitting too close together for a simple conversation. Randall began to linger his gaze on the church bills he used to sign without looking. He questioned his wife about every committee meeting, as if making some sort of schedule in his mind. "You know, dear," he said one evening, "I'm thinking of attending Sunday service. I haven't heard Reverend Kingsley preach in a long time." Mercer felt a chill run down her spine. She'd noticed that she and Ezra were finding it increasingly difficult to hide their feelings for each other. Their gazes met too often during services, and his voice changed when he addressed her. On the last Sunday in May, Ezra delivered a sermon on forgiveness. Agnes sat in the front row, clutching her rosary beads, and Randall, contrary to usual, didn't look at his phone but watched intently. After the service, Mercer found a note in her purse, written in familiar handwriting, "St. Mary's Chapel, tomorrow at noon." She knew she should throw it away, but instead she tucked it into her pocket. In the evening of the same day, a third letter arrived at the Kingsley house. Agnes looked at the photographs enclosed with it for a long time, and then locked her bedroom door for the first time in years. Chapter 4. The day before. The beginning of June was hot and sweltering. St. Michael's Church was preparing for an important event, the baptism of a California senator's granddaughter. Mercer supervised the preparations, transforming the ancient church into a Garden of Eden. White lilies and roses filled every corner, their fragrance mingling with the smell of incense and old wood. Randall took a sudden interest in the ceremony. He questioned his wife at length about the details of the upcoming sacrament, especially interested in the order of communion. "I never realized you were so interested in religious rituals," Mercer remarked, but her husband only shrugged. "It's time for me to get involved in the spiritual life." That same day, he visited his company's research division. A young chemist, Dr. Chen, was surprised to see the CEO in the lab. "Mr. Holliday, you do realize that you need special permits to work with such substances, don't you?" he asked nervously when Randall inquired about some of the chemicals. "This is for a government contract, Chen. All the paperwork will come later," Randall replied, jotting something down in his notebook. That evening, Mercer and Ezra met in the far corner of the church orchard. The old apple trees hid them from view. They spoke in whispers, afraid of being overheard. "I can't live like this anymore," Mercer said, snuggling against his chest. "These lies are killing me." "After the baptism," Ezra replied, kissing her hair. "I'll tell Agnes everything. I'll resign. We will leave this place. What about your ministry? God will understand. He knows our love is real." They did not notice a shadow flicker in the window of the church office. Agnes watched them, clutching a rosary in her hands. On her desk lay her husband's open day planner, where between the pages she found plane tickets to Mexico and paperwork for new names. Randall came home past midnight. The light in his office was on until morning, and from behind the door came the sound of a typewriter. At dawn, he stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the waking city. Then he took a small vial out of the safe and hid it in the inside pocket of his jacket. At breakfast, he took his wife's hand for the first time in years. "Things will get better, honey. You'll see." That morning, Agnes found a receipt from a jewelry store in her husband's coat pocket. He had bought a gold cross. "A gift for my goddaughter?" Ezra lied, but his wife saw the engraving on the receipt. "M.H. Forever Yours." At the church, the final preparations for tomorrow's ceremony were underway. Ezra was checking the communion chalices, arranging them in a certain order. Randall entered the sacristy unexpectedly, asking for a blessing. Their conversation lasted unusually long. Agnes, who was dusting the icons, noticed Randall lingering at the altar after his conversation with Ezra. She saw him scrutinizing the arrangement of the chalices, even making a note on his phone. It struck her as odd. In all her years of service, she'd never seen anyone in the congregation take such an interest in the details of communion. She had overheard his conversation with an elderly minister earlier that morning. Randall had asked at length about the order of service, and he was particularly interested in whether the priest always took communion first. There was something in his voice that made Agnes feel cold inside. She remembered an overheard telephone conversation about chemicals and reactions. The woman spent the whole day in prayer. In the evening, she took all the anonymous letters and photographs out of the box, put them in an envelope, and wrote the name on it. To Detective Tate Brogan. She hid the envelope under her pillow. Before she went to bed, she stared at her and Ezra's wedding picture for a long time. "Forgive me, Lord," she whispered, setting her alarm for early morning. She decided she'd get to the church first, so she'd have time to check everything before the service. At the holiday house, Randall worked late into the night in his office. Mercer heard him call the lab several times, saying something about chemical composition and reactions. At midnight, he went up to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. "You know, it's been a long time since I've told you how much I love you," he said unexpectedly softly. Mercer felt tears come to her throat. She knew that tomorrow everything would change forever, but she couldn't imagine how tragic that change would be. That night, none of the main participants in the coming drama could sleep. Everyone was thinking about tomorrow, not suspecting that fate had already written its script, and it would turn out to be more terrible than any human plans. Sunday morning was cloudless. The bells of St. Michael's Church rang especially solemnly, summoning the parishioners to the baptism ceremony. Servants in white cloaks bustled around the font, arranging the silver candlesticks and laying out starched towels. Agnes was the earliest to arrive. She moved between the rows, adjusting the flower arrangements, as if trying to find in this routine work an escape from her heavy thoughts. Her footsteps echoed in the empty church. Ezra appeared in the sacristy an hour before the service began. His hands trembled slightly as he donned his festive vestments. Pulling an ancient silver-encased gospel from a cabinet, he stared at his reflection in the polished metal for a long moment. Mercer entered the church with the first parishioners. Her cream-colored dress harmonized perfectly with the white lilies on the altar. Randall, unaccustomed to silence, kept close to her, every now and then adjusting his tie with a nervous movement. By 10 o'clock, the church was filled with people. The senator and his family occupied the front row. A baby in a christening gown quietly sobbed in his mother's arms. Press photographers waited patiently at the entrance. The baptism of the senator's granddaughter was an important secular event. The service began. Ezra spoke about the sacrament of baptism, about spiritual rebirth, about the purity of the soul. His voice was deeper than usual, and only Agnes noticed how he avoided looking toward the third row where Mercer sat. After the baptism of the infant, communion began. Servants brought in silver bowls of wine, arranging them on the altar. Ezra blessed the gifts, reciting ancient words of prayer. Agnes watched his movements as if seeing them for the first time. Suddenly, she rose from her seat. No one noticed her movement. All eyes were fixed on the altar where Ezra was preparing to give communion to the flock. Only Randall, who sat on the aisle, turned his head slightly. The priest, by tradition, was to be the first to take communion. Ezra raised the cup, but before he could bring it to his lips, Agnes was at his side. "Let me," she whispered so quietly that no one heard. Ezra froze with the raised cup. For a moment, their gazes met. There was something in Agnes's eyes that made his heart skip a beat. She took the cup from his hands with a soft but decisive movement. "In the name of the Father," she said, and took a sip. The silence in the church became absolute. One could hear the buzzing of a bee tangled in the stained glass. Agnes slowly lowered the cup. A surprised expression appeared on her face, as if she had seen something unusual in the high vaults of the church. Then she staggered. Ezra managed to pick her up, but it was too late. The silver bowl rolled across the marble slabs, leaving dark drops on the white stone. The screams didn't start immediately. At first, there was only silence and perplexed looks. Then someone shouted, "Call an ambulance!" But Agnes was no longer breathing. She was lying on the altar steps, and white lilies, scattered from an overturned vase, surrounded her head like a halo. Randall Holliday remained seated motionless, staring straight ahead. His hand clutched the armrest of the bench with such force that his knuckles turned white. Mercer covered her face with her hands. Ezra knelt beside his wife's body, lips moving soundlessly, whether he was praying or apologizing. The sound of police sirens broke the Sunday silence. Detective Tate Brogan was on his way. Detective Tate Brogan arrived at St. Michael's Church 12 minutes after the call. In his 50s, he could still run up the church steps without losing his breath. He was met by a young officer, pale and clearly shaken by what was happening. "The church is cordoned off, Detective. Witnesses are in the refectory. The body hasn't been moved. Forensics are on their way." Brogan nodded and stepped inside. The smell of lilies and incense mingled with something else, a faint, bitter odor. Agnes Kingsley lay at the altar, her gray dress almost blending into the marble of the floor. An overturned silver bowl gleamed beside the body. "Who discovered the body?" "Everyone," the officer replied. "It happened right during the service. She drank the communion wine and dropped dead." Brogan crouched beside the body, scrutinizing the face of the deceased. No signs of violent death, just a strange pallor and a faint blue around the lips. The refectory was quiet despite the number of people the senator and his family had already left. The press secretary had insisted on an immediate departure to avoid a scandal. The other witnesses sat in groups, some crying, others talking quietly. The Reverend Ezra Kingsley sat apart, his festive vestments wrinkled and his gaze seemingly absent. An envelope lay on the table beside him. "This was found in Mrs. Kingsley's bedroom," the officer explained. "She was going to give it to you." Brogan opened the envelope. Photographs, letters, some notes, all neatly arranged by date. He took a quick look at the contents, his eyebrows raised slightly. Mercer Holliday sat in the far corner, her husband standing by the window, talking on the phone. Brogan noted that they were keeping apart. "Reverend," the detective took a seat across from Ezra. "Tell me what happened." "She wasn't supposed to drink first," the priest said quietly. "According to the canon, I take communion first. But Agnes, she just walked over and took the cup." At that moment, the CSI entered the refectory. "Detective, you should see this." He held out a preliminary report to Brogan. "Traces of cyanide were found in the wine. The concentration is lethal." Brogan looked around the room slowly. A priest who'd lost his wife. A businessman whose company manufactures chemicals. His beautiful wife with a trail of tears on her face. All of them were not telling him something. By evening, he had 3 main suspects and dozens of questions. Why did Agnes break the communion order? Where had the poison come from? What was in the note the young minister had tried to discreetly take out of his pocket? In the priest's office, the detective found an unfinished cup of coffee and a fresh issue of the newspaper. In the margins of the article on divorce were penciled notes in Agnes's handwriting. "God sees everything." When darkness fell, Brogan released most of the witnesses, making them promise not to leave town. Only the forensics team remained in the church, methodically examining every inch of the floor around the altar. "Sir," one of them beckoned to the detective, "there are fingerprints in the bowl. At least 3 people's." Brogan nodded. In 20 years of service, he'd learned to sense when a case was going to be complicated. This was just such a case with secrets hidden behind church walls and sins disguised as virtue. Before leaving, he took one more look at the crime scene. In the light of the setting sun, the stained glass windows cast multicolored shadows on the marble floor where someone's life had been cut short hours ago. And now it was his job to figure out if this death had been accidental or if someone had planned this last communion very carefully. Brogan looked at the photographs from Agnes's envelope in his office. Each one showed Mercer and Ezra, in a bookstore, in a church garden, at the entrance to a small cafe in a neighboring town. The dates on the back added up to a clear chronology of a secret affair. "Detective," Sergeant Nina Ramirez peered through the door. "Reverend Kingsley is here." Ezra looked aged over the 2 days. The black suit had replaced the church vestments, but the shirt collar still resembled a pastor's. "Tell me about your relationship with Mrs. Holliday." Brogan placed the photographs on the table. Ezra was silent for a long time, looking at the pictures. Then he spoke, quietly but firmly. "I loved her from the first time I met her. Tried to fight that feeling. I prayed, but love was stronger than vows." "Did your wife know?" "I guessed. Lately, she's been crying a lot at night. I pretended not to hear." "Why did she take the bowl?" "I don't know." Ezra shook his head. "It was against all the rules. It was like she knew something." After the priest left, Brogan summoned Mercer. She came in wearing a strict black dress, but the lipstick on her lips was flawless, a small detail that spoke volumes. "You were going to run away together?" Mercer shuddered. "Who told you?" "Tickets to Mexico, new documents. Agnes found them." "Yes," Mercer whispered. "After the baptism, we couldn't pretend anymore." "And your husband? Did he know?" "Randall?" She grinned bitterly. "He didn't notice for months that I'd stopped wearing my wedding ring. He was only interested in stocks and contracts." But Brogan already knew that wasn't true. Outside surveillance of Randall Holliday revealed a different picture. In the week before the tragedy, he had visited 3 chemistry labs, met suspicious people at a motel outside of town, sat for hours in his car in front of a bookstore where lovers met. "Boss," Sergeant Ramirez put the forensics report on the table. "Gloves were found in the dumpster behind Holliday's house. They had traces of cyanide on them. Prints? We're working on it. But there's something else. They found a note in Agnes's coat pocket. Looks like a farewell letter." Brogan unfolded the sheet. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in a hurry. "Forgive me, Lord, for what I'm about to do, but I have to protect him, even if it's a sin." "Check her bank accounts," Brogan ordered. She may have been planning something too. By evening, the picture began to clear. Agnes had withdrawn all her savings the day before she died. Randall had sent a large transfer to an offshore account. A shipment of chemicals was missing from his company's lab. "Sir," the young forensic scientist held out a new report. "There are 3 sets of prints on the bowl. The Reverend's, Mrs. Kingsley's, and another partial. Belongs to a male, but there's no clear match." Brogan leaned back in his chair, looking at the pictures on the wall. A love triangle that had turned into a deadly puzzle. A cheating husband with access to poisons. A priest willing to break his vows. A wife determined to set things right. And Agnes. What did she really know? St. Michael's Church still smelled of lilies, though the flowers had long since wilted. Brogan stood at the altar, mentally reconstructing the events of that morning. Someone had planned the murder. Someone had wanted the poison bowl to go to a certain person. But the plan was disrupted when Agnes broke the communion order. Or was that the plan? The ringing of his cell phone interrupted his musings. The lab. "Detective, glove analysis is complete. There are traces of sweat inside. DNA belongs to..." Brogan listened, and his face grew increasingly somber. The web of lies was beginning to unravel, but the truth was scarier than he'd realized. "It started in March." The elderly Mrs. Fletcher adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. "I noticed right away the way the Reverend was looking at Mrs. Holliday. Getting old, but my eyes are still sharp." Brogan methodically interviewed the parishioners, piecing together from their testimony a mosaic of the events of the past few months. A story that had seemed simple was growing in detail. "They met in the old chapel," said the gardener, an elderly Mr. Corbett. "Thought no one could see them, but I prune the roses by the east wall every Thursday. Heard a lot of things." In Brogan's office, a stack of testimony was growing. Each witness added a new touch to the portrait of this strange triangle: a cold, perpetually busy husband, a lonely, beautiful wife, a charismatic priest who had forgotten his vows. The finance department filed a report on the movements in Holliday's accounts. Unusual transactions, strange transfers through a network of small companies, all of which called for a more thorough investigation. Brogan met with the old minister, Peter Dowling, in a small cafe across from the church. The older man was nervous, twirling a cup of cold coffee in his hands. "Mr. Halliday came in several times," he finally said. "Asked about the order of service. He was especially interested in communion, who drank after whom, whether the order could be changed. And that morning..." "What was that morning?" "I saw him go into the sacristy, early before the Reverend came. Thought about telling Father Ezra, but Mr. Halliday's on the church board, he's entitled." In the evening, the detective came to the church again. In the semi-darkness, the stained glass windows seemed like black failures. He walked slowly down the aisle, reconstructing the events. In the pocket of Randall's work jacket, they found a note with the order of communion, neatly organized by minute. Why was a successful businessman so interested in the details of a church service? "Detective," Sergeant Ramirez called out. "They found traces of chemicals in Holliday's lab. Forensics is working on analyzing it." Brogan stared at the altar where tragedy had played out. Agnes had violated the order of communion. For the first time in her husband's entire service. Why? What did she know or suspect? In her bedroom, they found a short note hidden in her prayer book. "He is preparing something terrible. I must protect him." The picture slowly emerged. A deceived husband who found out about the affair. An elaborate plan of revenge. And a random victim determined to protect the man she loved, unaware that he was the target. The detective took another look at the crime scene. Somewhere here, among the church utensils and holy relics, hidden among the last clues that could confirm his hunch. He just needed to know where to look. Detective Brogan sat in his office, littered with documents and photographs. On the wall, he'd created a timeline of events, from Mercer and Ezra's first meeting to the tragedy at the church. Red threads linked key moments. "It all started with the diary," he murmured, looking at the entries. Randall had accidentally found his wife's notes and learned of the affair, but instead of creating a scandal, he began plotting revenge. A search warrant for Holliday's office was obtained by late afternoon. Brogan personally supervised the operation. In the impecunious businessman's office, every item was in its proper place. Even the paper clips on the desk were lined up by size. "Sir!" One of the officers pointed to a safe behind a painting. Inside revealed a folder of chemistry lab paperwork, an order for a small batch of reagents, formula, instructions for use. He planned it all in advance, Brogan showed the papers to the expert. Ordered the poison through his company, forged the paperwork to look like a government contract. Sergeant Ramirez brought in the forensics on the gloves found in the dumpster. There were traces of sweat on the inside and microparticles of cyanide on the outside. "Do we have enough evidence?" she asked. Brogan nodded. "Call the judge. We need an arrest warrant." The interrogation of the servant brought the last piece of the puzzle. The old man admitted that he'd seen Randall come to the church early in the morning on the day of the tragedy. He was doing something with the communion chalices. I thought he was helping with preparations for the service. At 9 p.m., the detective called Randall in for a second interview. The businessman looked tired, but held himself confidently. "Tell me again where you were this morning before the service?" "At home, preparing papers for the board of directors." "That's odd." Brogan placed the surveillance photo in front of him. "Because you were seen outside the church at 6 this morning." Holliday was silent, looking at the photo. His fingers trembled faintly. "We found traces of poison in the lab, found the gloves, know about the chemical order." Brogan spoke calmly, almost sympathetically. "You planned to kill Reverend Kingsley, but Agnes disrupted the communion order." "You don't understand," Randall finally uttered. "He destroyed my family, stole my wife, used his ministry to... And you decided to kill him?" "I wanted justice." Randall looked up. "He was supposed to die by communion. Symbolic, isn't it? But that stupid woman, she ruined everything." Brogan pulled out an arrest warrant. "Randall Holliday, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Agnes Kingsley." As Holliday was led away, the detective returned to his diagram on the wall, a story of love and revenge that ended in the death of an innocent man. "Sir," Ramirez peeked through the door, "Reverend Kingsley is asking to see you. Says he wants to make a confession." Brogan shook his head. Church confessions were one thing. Police reports are quite another. He already had a killer. Let the rest be between the priest and his conscience. The prison interrogation room was small and impersonal. Randall Holliday, until yesterday a successful businessman, sat behind a metal desk in an orange robe. His manicured hands, unused to handcuffs, twitched nervously. Detective Brogan placed a folder of evidence on the table. "Tell me everything from the beginning." "I found her diary in March," Randall began. "It fell out of her purse. I wasn't going to read it, just opened it to see whose it was. And there are pages full of declarations of love for him. That saint." He fell silent, examining his hands. "I didn't believe it at first. Mercer, my wife, with some priest? I started following her, saw their meetings. I saw the way they looked at each other during the service, the way he touches her hand, handing over church papers." The story of revenge unfolded gradually, like frames of slow motion. Randall recounted how he planned the murder, how he studied the effects of poisons, how he forged documents to purchase the chemicals. Why communion? Poetic justice. Holliday grinned bitterly. He desecrated his ministry, his vows. I wanted him to die by Holy Communion. How ironic. His plan was well thought out. The poison in the priest's cup, the order of communion, where Ezra was to drink first. Gloves so as to leave no trace. But Agnes, I didn't want her dead. She was as much a victim as I was. When she took the cup, I wanted to scream to stop her, but that would have meant giving myself away. Brogan looked at the man before him, broken, having lost everything to blind jealousy and a desire for revenge. "Do you realize what awaits you?" "Life," Randall nodded. "But you know what, detective? Prison is nothing compared to what I feel every time I close my eyes and see Agnes's face at the moment of her death." 6 months later, Randall Holliday was sentenced to life in prison for premeditated murder. Although Agnes was not his target, the law makes no distinction. Death by attempting to kill another person is punished just as harshly. Mercer sold their home in Palo Alto and moved to the East Coast. She is said to work for a charity that helps victims of domestic violence. Ezra Kingsley retired from the ministry. His last service was in memory of Agnes. After that, he disappeared. Some say they saw him at a small monastery in the mountains of Colorado, where he lives as a simple novice. St. Michael's Church has a new pastor. White lilies no longer adorn the altar. By unspoken agreement, they have been replaced by modest wildflowers. Detective Brogan sometimes visits the cemetery where Agnes is buried. On her headstone are engraved the words of Scripture. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He stands there looking at the grave of a woman whose attempt to protect the one she loved turned out to be her own undoing. The story of love and revenge is over, leaving behind only the bitter taste of unfulfilled hopes and shattered destinies. And an old church book still contains Agnes's last note, never read to the end. "Forgive me, Lord, for not loving enough to save them all."